So now we come to the concept of weaponized migration, which is also called coercive migration in the literature. This concept comes from Kelly Greenhill, who's a prominent scholar in security studies, and she wrote the book Weapons of Mass Migration. I think I have a short video on that a little bit too. And in this book, she explains that mass population movements, or even just the threat of a mass population movement, that is regularly used as a geopolitical strategy by state or non-state actors in the modern world in order to hurt, destabilize, or gain concessions from their target. And it's not some fringe idea or weird conspiracy theory by right-wing nuts or whatever. It's a well-established concept within the field of international relations and security studies. There's like a big group at MIT that studies this specifically. And the research shows that coercive migration has been used as a tool of statecraft at least once a year for the past like 60 years. It's an exceedingly common phenomenon in global politics today. And we can basically break it down in between active and passive versions of migration weaponization. In the active form, there's a sudden and intentional displacement of a population, often creating what's called a humanitarian crisis. And the goal would be, in this case, to achieve a strategic or political objective very rapidly, whether that's economic leverage, as in cases where states bordering crises have managed to extract billions of dollars in aid to cope with the influx of refugees, or just political pressure in order to destabilize an opposing regime, increase social tensions, even force policy changes. An example of the active form of weaponization would be the Mariel boat lift, in which Castro in Cuba sent like 125,000 Cubans. And these were like prisoners, they're criminals, they're mentally ill, whatever. And he sent them to the United States. This should sound fairly familiar to you. And the US government was basically caught off guard, and there was a lot of political and social turmoil. And, this was a deliberate act by Castro to offload Cuban undesirables and to put pressure on the United States. Um, in the active form, the hostile actor doesn't just allow the migration. This is the sort of important distinction here, but he actively engineers it by forcefully displacing people, by expelling a specific population, or by deliberately creating conditions that ensure mass exodus takes place, and then it's used to achieve a kind of immediate effect. Passive weaponization, on the other hand, is a more long term geopolitical strategy. And in this case, the migratory flow is not necessarily created by expelling the population, but is rather enabled, facilitated, or allowed to happen in some way by the actor. The objective remains the same, gaining leverage, destabilizing rivals, etc., but the tactics are subtler and often appear to be less aggressive, which ultimately is going to mean that, given especially the humanitarian discourse and the liberal international order, it's more effective, I think. For example, Belarus recently engaged in passive weaponization, allowing African migrants and Middle Eastern migrants to enter the country and cross over into Poland and Lithuania. And this was a form of sort of revenge against the EU for sanctions. And the Belarusian regime facilitated this migration in order to create pressure, to put pressure on the EU and to destabilize it politically, um, creating, straining their social safety nets and things like that. So why does this work? Weaponized migration works for a few key reasons. First, immigration is universally contentious, so everywhere you go, people will tend to perceive large-scale immigration invasions as a threat to social cohesion, very surprising. And this creates or exacerbates tension within the host society, weakening it politically, socially, potentially economically. Second, it strains public resources. States that receive large numbers of migrants, especially all of a sudden, they face a lot of pressure on their welfare systems, housing, education, healthcare services. And this is especially true in developed countries where there are a lot of public services available and they're sort of already stretched thin. The rapid influx of migrants can pretty easily overwhelm these systems. Finally, and perhaps most importantly, this tactic works because of the dominant humanitarian discourse in the liberal international order. In wealthier, more developed countries, especially those in Western Europe and North America, there's sort of a deeply ingrained belief that human rights and humanitarianism requires states to accept refugees. We have heard this a million times. This is sort of the mantra. And this belief is institutionalized actually through international laws like the 1951 Refugee Convention, reinforced by NGOs, global human rights frameworks, the United Nations. We're going to talk about all that stuff in great detail a little later on. But this discourse frames any attempt to control borders or limit immigration as morally suspect. It's something only a bigot would do. You're Islamophobic or something like that. This humanitarian discourse essentially enables coercion by turning the tables on wealthier states, making it politically impossible for them to turn away migrants without being seen in some way as violating international norms or human rights. And so I think it really works as part of the coercive migration apparatus, right? It's part of the coercion. And again, we're going to talk about the financial networks associated with this stuff a little bit later. That's sort of going to be the key parts of this series, I think. But so in the context of liquid modernity, mass migration becomes even more strategically useful. We live in a world where borders are being blurred. The old, solid, modern structures, things like nation states, sovereign borders, long-term institutions, they're all increasingly being dissolved. And as these traditional structures break down, the flow of people, just like the flow of capital and ideas, intensifies. In this world of fluidity, migration is a tool that can be used to erode the sovereignty of states while benefiting a wide array of actors, corporations, multilateral organizations, some governments. Again, we're going to get into all this as we continue through the series. And in this sense, the weaponization of migration fits very neatly into a broader pattern of liquid modernity where flexibility, mobility, and fluidity dominate every aspect of our lives at the expense of solid, stable, enduring structures, the kind which once defined the modern world and gave us sort of solace and protection and meaning. But the point here with weaponized migration is that mass migration isn't just an accidental byproduct of a conflict. It's not a natural phenomenon. It's not simply a product of economic hardship or something like that. It's actually an integral part of a global strategy in this new world order, one that benefits elites while undermining national sovereignty and destabilizing societies.